ואנו מכריזים בזאת
Hello, I'm Barry Shaw. This is The View from Israel. For those of you who missed our first video, which was me talking with Ambassador Yoram Ettinger about the upcoming US election as it applies to the presidential race, I would refer you to the YouTube Rumble video on that particular. Now, today, I've invited Ambassador Ettinger to be my guest in talking about the potential effects of the upcoming election when it comes to the Congressional record, which is again equally important for Israel. Let me very briefly introduce Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. Yoram was Minister for Congressional Affairs at the Israel Embassy in Washington, D.C. This is where he's, let's say, a top expert in talking about such things. This was before he became an Israeli Consul General Ambassador in Houston, Texas. Basically, as I mentioned in the first video, he knows what makes America tick. So, Yoram Ettinger, Ambassador Ettinger, welcome to The View from Israel.
Thank you.
I'd like you to give us your update about the importance and the potential advantages or pitfalls of the upcoming election as it applies to the Congressional elections.
Well, the tendency, both in Israel definitely, but also in the US, is to consider the president to be the commander-in-chief shaping solely, alone, US foreign policy, US national security. Most people assume that Congress plays a very, very substantial role when it comes to domestic policies, not foreign and national security policy. But this is not the reality. The reality is that the US legislature, both chambers, the House and the Senate, in accordance with the US Constitution and as demonstrated through a litany of presidents, is indeed co-equal to the executive, not only domestically, but also externally, foreign and national security policy. We're talking about the US Constitution, which does highlight the legislature as the first article in the Constitution. And this was not decided by flipping a coin, which branch of government will be the first, the second, or the third. The founding fathers had in mind a small government type of liberty society and a president who is not going to be a monarch, who will not regard himself or herself as a monarch. And the Constitution achieved that by according the legislature with abundance of power through checks and balances, transforming the American legislature into the most powerful legislature anywhere in the world. Obviously, members of the House and the Senate prefer to be preoccupied with local issues. House members are elected because of district issues. Senators are elected because of state issues, and they would like to accord as much time as possible to those local issues. They prefer to allow the president to deal with foreign and national security unless they decide that the president has strayed from the proper course of action, whether legally or policy-wise. Once the legislature decides that the president is not walking the line the way they want, the members of the House and the senators, they can demonstrate, they can flex a muscle which can stop, block a president, can clip the wings of a president, and can also shape a policy irrespective of what the president wants. In fact, former Secretary of State Jim Baker, who was the so-called almighty foreign policy, national security person during the Bush administration, Bush senior administration, he was known to complain that every time he comes to Capitol Hill, he is encountered by 535 legislators who consider themselves to be secretaries of state, and he complained, how can one advance foreign policy, national security policy under the constraint of being supervised, overseen, appropriated by 535 such legislators. Secretary of Defense during the same administration, Dick Cheney, used to complain that Congress produces papers on national security which are like a mountain trying to block the administration. And we have seen that. We have seen that in multitude of precedents. Also when it comes to Israel. And when it comes to Israel, there has been a very, very significant difference between the legislature and the executive. From 1948, from President Truman until the current President Biden, every single president pressured Israel. Some presidents even punished Israel, suspending shipment of combat aircraft, suspending defense cooperation, commercial cooperation agreements in response to Israeli policy, which was contrary to the president's own policy. There was, by the way, only one president who never pressured Israel, and that was President Trump. However, from 1948 until today, every single Congress, House and Senate systematically supported Israel. Obviously, there has been an erosion in recent years, but this is an erosion of the majority which supports Israel. And Congress has demonstrated its ability to constrain president. For instance, we are engaged right now in Israel's war against Hamas and Israel's war against Hezbollah, and a certain war also against the head of the octopus or the head of the snake, which is in Tehran, the Ayatollahs of Iran. And there is pressure by the administration on Israel. There has been suspension, delay of supply of vital ammunition and vital military systems to Israel. If we go back to 2014, one of Israel's wars against Hamas, during that war, Israel requested the resupply of Iron Dome missiles. This is, by the way, part of the initial agreement between the U.S. and Israel. Israel is the one that solely developed the Iron Dome technology, shared it later on with the US. Most of the manufacturing of the Iron Dome is transferred gradually more and more to the US. And part of the agreement is for the US to resupply the necessary Iron Dome missiles. In 2014, Israel had to be resupplied with the missiles, which minimized Israeli losses, and also enabled Israel to reduce its firepower against the Arabs in Gaza. And Congress approved, authorized, appropriated the requested resupply of Iron Dome, but President Obama delayed his signing the Congressional authorization and appropriation. And he delayed it purposely in order to pressure Israel and squeeze some concessions from Israel with regard to the Palestinian issue. He delayed it until the day that Congress was about to recess for the summer recess, which would have meant delay of resupply by a month, and that would have a dramatic, negative setback effect on the war in Gaza. And as I said, it's not only required to protect Israelis, it's also required to restrain the Israeli firepower against the Arabs in Gaza. The day before Congress was supposed to recess, a few senators, headed by then chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, joined by Republican Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who was the senior Republican on armed services, and 3 or 4 other senators called the White House and made it very clear to the president, unless the president signs the resupply of Iron Dome before the recess, Congress will not provide the president with, or will not comply with any of the presidential requests concerning the next budget. And within an hour or 2 hours, there was a phone call from the White House. The president just signed the authorization. And that's one of multitude of such demonstration of the power of Congress. We're talking about such issues as sanctions. President Trump did not want to impose sanctions on Russia during Putin's time in Russia. Congress thought that Putin deserved to be sanctioned, and therefore sanctions indeed were imposed on Putin, irrespective of the president's opposition. Obviously, the president can veto any decision. 2/3 are required to overturn it, but also if you have sanctions within a budget proposed, which also caters to the president is very, very constrained as far as his veto power. President Obama did not want to impose sanctions on the Muslim Brotherhood government of Egypt because he considered and still considers Muslim Brotherhood to be non-terrorist. Congress, on the other hand, was much more realistic than President Obama, recognizing the terroristic features of the Muslim Brotherhood, the threat that they pose to every single pro-American Arab government and to the stability of the area, the impact of the Muslim Brotherhood on Islamic terrorism throughout the world, being the #1 Sunni Islamic terror organization, and therefore Congress imposed sanctions on the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, independent of and irrespective of President Obama's opposition. You can go back to different military engagements by the U.S. The war in Southeast Asia was over because Congress wanted it over, irrespective of President Nixon, who did not think that it was the right way and the right time to end that war. Congress did not like the U.S. military involvement in Angola during President Nixon and then Trump's time, President Ford's time in the White House. But Congress did not think that the U.S. military involvement in Angola, which was part of the Cold War at that time, and the concern for expanding Soviet influence in South Africa, and indeed the U.S. had to end its military involvement in Angola, and so it was during Reagan's time when there was military involvement in Nicaragua, again, against the pro-Soviet elements. Congress did not like it, and that military involvement was over. And obviously for Israel, for the Jewish people at large, the issue of Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union to Israel, about 1.25 million Jews who came to Israel from the Soviet Union, that was facilitated by U.S. Congress. When that time Senator Jackson with Congressman Vanik decided to introduce a legislation conditioning any support to the Soviet Union, and later on it became support for Russia, would be preconditioned upon opening emigration to anyone in the Soviet Union. And when the time came, Soviet Union got disintegrated, and they needed U.S. foreign aid. I think it was $900 million annual foreign aid. It had to be preconditioned upon opening the gates of emigration, which was legislated by Congress against the position by President Nixon. And by the way, President Nixon did not oppose emigration. President Nixon was concerned that such a legislation could trigger very dangerous intensification of the Cold War into a hot war. He was also concerned about the repercussion on potential pogroms against Jews in the Soviet Union. The fact is that Senator Jackson and Congressman Vanik were determined to proceed. They had more than 3/4 of the legislature supporting it, which means a veto override, and the outcome has been 1.25 million Jews emigrating to Israel, and by the way, many more emigrating to the US, Canada, Australia, Germany, etc., all a result of congressional muscle in opposition to presidential stance. When it comes to Israel, also an example which demonstrates how substantial is the congressional, the legislature muscle in the areas of national security and defense. If you go back to the Bush days in the White House, Bush-Baker days in the White House, those were very, very tense and sometimes ugly days in the attitude by Bush-Baker towards Israeli Prime Minister Shamir. I was at the Israeli embassy at that time, and I witnessed, felt it every single day. And while the President and the Secretary of State did not want any expansion of defense and commercial cooperation between the two countries, while they wanted to pressure Prime Minister Shamir into significant concessions, those 4 years were years of unprecedented expansion of collaboration between the two countries due to congressional initiatives. I would say probably 90% of the initiatives which expanded the ties between the two countries were the outcome of congressional initiatives through amendments to the defense budget, through amendments to foreign aid budget and other venues. And each time it was in defiance of presidential opposition. Being an echo of the State Department is very different than being a staunch supporter of U.S.-Israel relations, which since 1948 has usually gone contrary to positions by the State Department, which opposed the legislation to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and certainly different from the position of the State Department, which did not like the Abraham Accords because they did not include reference to a Palestinian state. So the outcome of this coming election, again, would have direct impact on U.S.-Israel relation, on U.S. pressure or no pressure on Israel, because the chairman of the appropriations, the chairman of the appropriations subcommittee on defense or subcommittee on foreign operation those chairmen do have the muscle to impact presidential policy. And if you are a progressive chairperson, certainly that would have a negative impact. Maybe just one example, the current chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense is a staunch supporter of Israel. Should there be a change of majority in the House and majority will shift back to Democrats, apparently, if we observe the issue of seniority and clout among Democrats, we are going to witness a chairwoman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, Betty McCollum from Minnesota. Very few members of the House have been as antagonistic to Israel, as critical of enhanced U.S.-Israel relations as has been Betty McCollum. And certainly, if you shift from a staunch supporter to a staunch critic, that means a lot to U.S.-Israel relations.
the time of Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party was about to be elected to be Prime Minister, the Labour Party was absolutely drenched in anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism had its face not only in anti-Semitism from within the parliament itself, but down to the branch office, but it expressed itself, particularly its support of Palestinians and anti-Israel measures. And I said at that time it wouldn't take long before this anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, would leap across the pond to America. Now, more recently, what we've been seeing in Europe is we have a conflict going on in civil society between the points and the politics supported by some socialist politicians in support of the rising migrant population and the indigenous nations of Europe, in Sweden and Britain in particular. I mention those two countries because right now, when I speak to you, both of those parliaments have representatives who are spokespeople for Hamas inside their parliaments, both of them, because the electorate is increasingly made up of immigrants and migrants to the country who have their own cultures, their own political agendas, and it's expressing itself. And we can see this also playing out in America, both on the streets and on the campuses. So you're right. When you said that the oversight and committee can challenge, let's say, the decisions of the State Department and the White House, that really depends, because who controls the House and the Senate? If you have counterbalances, checks and balances, that's fine. But if you have a House and a Senate that is particularly, let's say, democratically a majority supporting a President Harris, for instance, that could lead them to make decisions which would impact Israel far more differently than if, for instance, the Republicans held the control of the Senate and the Congress under a Trump presidency. So this has impact. It has impact both on the population, the voting population, but also on the outcome for an impact and what it could have on Israel. Before you answer that, I want to add one other point, because of this points to the strange politics that's going on in America right now. There was a rising independent candidate for presidency, Robert Kennedy, RFK Jr. And the Democrats worked ceaselessly to try and have him taken off the ballot in a number of Democrat-controlled states. Yet they talk about democracy. That isn't democracy. However, I'm making the point because Kennedy was so disgusted with the actions of the Democrat Party that he actually stood as an independent, and beyond that, he, as an independent, decided and made the decision, both publicly, to actually support a Trump presidency, even when he is president. Now, I know to remind our viewers that RFK Jr. was rendered fatherless by a Palestinian who hated Jews. Sirhan is still in prison to this day. He's a Palestinian who one day after the Six-Day War wanted to punish Robert Kennedy, that's RFK Jr.'s father, his support of Israel, so he killed him. This brings me back to what's going on both in Europe, where some Islam migrant actually killed a conservative member of parliament, and we had an attempt on the life of Trump fairly recently. So tempers are high, and I wouldn't put anything past it. But quite frankly, the stench of anti-Semitism in America ranks perhaps even higher, as we can see on the streets, on the campuses, than perhaps far more vocal and far more threatening than perhaps it was even in Britain. In the past, anti-Semitism was dressed up as anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, but today it's anti-Israelism is dressed up as anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. And this is expressing itself both in the politics, both in Europe and increasingly in America.
Well, maybe two comments. Again, everybody should be alarmed, but we should not apply that to the Democratic Party, which supposedly sanctions such radical, hateful position. The majority does not. The majority does not, and again, it is reflected in the voting patterns in the House and in the Senate. The members of the House especially, but also members of the Senate, do not vote in contradiction to their voters. A member of the House who defies the roughly 760,000 Americans in his or her district, if you do not vote in accordance with the state of mind of your district, you'll be voted out after 2 years on Capitol Hill, and likewise in the Senate. That is a result of the very unique American political system, most notably the very strict separation of power. In the US, under the separation of power, the president is not a super legislator, as is the case, sadly, in Israel and in many European, maybe even all European countries. In the US, there is a strict separation, which means members of the House and the Senate are accountable to their voters more than to their president or to their party bosses. And that strengthens the muscles of the legislators. And therefore, on many occasions, you can see Democrats or Republicans voting against a president of their own party because of sticking with their voters. One case of many cases is the senator from West Virginia, Manchin. And West Virginia is a very, very much a Republican state. Manchin is the only non-Republican holding a statewide office, and he has to be very careful if he wants to remain in the Senate. He's retiring, by the way, after serving West Virginia, I think for 2 or 3 terms, I think 3 terms. But during his term in the Senate, on many occasions, he did not please Democratic presidents with his vote. Another point which I think I need to emphasize, when one talks about the checks and balances and the legislature being by far the strongest legislature anywhere in the world, we are talking about the power of the purse. The power of the purse is on Capitol Hill, House and Senate, not on Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House. And the president does submit requests, the president does propose, but it's up to the House and the Senate to render the final decision. And unlike, again, in Israel, and unlike possibly in many European countries, they do not succumb easily to presidential or prime minister's pressure of their own party. They first and foremost stand by their constituents' preferences and world view. And again, for me as an Israeli, I feel very, very much secure with such an American political system, because it's not only the most powerful legislature anywhere in the world, it's also a legislature which systematically have stood by enhanced U.S.-Israel relations, even when it came to defy American presidents.
Okay, thank you, Joram. Thank you, Ambassador Oettinger, for this conversation. I hope you found this interesting. Joram, I'd like to invite you back for another conversation, perhaps move the conversation to the Middle East and the role and the impact and the threat of Iran, not only on Israel, but in the Middle East, and what can be done to combat that rising threat. Thank you for being my guest on the show, Joram. Till next time, this is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Lawrence, for producing the whole program.
אנו מכריזים בזאת